If you want to see more detailed images, videos, and the full article, check the link in the description. A scathing independent review has exposed significant shortcomings in Australia's Closing the Gap strategy, revealing a systemic failure by governments to address entrenched disadvantage faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research at the University of Technology Sydney conducted the first independent assessment of the strategy since its inception in 2008, a landmark agreement committing all Australian governments and the Coalition of Peaks, representing over 80 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled organizations, ACOs, to a renewed partnership focused on shared decision-making and structural reform. The review, based on extensive consultations with over 500 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across Australia, paints a stark picture. While acknowledging the sound overall architecture of the agreement, the report points to critical systemic failures, notably the inaction of governments and the pervasive issue of structural racism deeply embedded within societal structures. The report explicitly states that this racism is not merely a peripheral issue, but a pervasive force impacting every facet of the Closing the Gap strategy. Furthermore, the report highlights the alarming fact that governments have demonstrably failed to take meaningful steps to address this systemic racism, despite explicit commitments within the national agreement. The report's authors contend that this inaction stems from a deeply rooted problem, suggesting that racism was woven into the very fabric of government institutions since the nation's founding. The review's findings are particularly damning in light of the latest government update on Closing the Gap targets. Only 4 targets are currently on track, 6 are showing improvement but remain off track, 4 are worsening, and a further 4 are simply inaccessible. This data underscores the profound challenges faced and the limited progress achieved despite the stated aims of the agreement. The report emphatically concludes that the burden of achieving positive change rests disproportionately on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and organizations, while government entities bear a significantly lighter responsibility. The ACOs and communities are, according to the report, doing the heavy lifting while simultaneously grappling with inadequate resources compared to government counterparts. This disparity highlights a fundamental imbalance in the distribution of responsibility and resources, hindering effective implementation of the Closing the Gap strategy. The escalating rate of Indigenous incarceration serves as a sobering indicator of the strategy's shortcomings. Data reveals a 20% increase in the Indigenous prison population since 2019, a stark statistic that underscores the urgent need for more effective interventions. This alarming trend directly contradicts the overarching goals of the Closing the Gap strategy and further highlights the failure to adequately address systemic inequalities affecting Indigenous Australians. The report calls for a fundamental re-evaluation of the relationship between governments and the Coalition of Peaks, urging a critical examination of how this dynamic either supports or undermines the strategy's implementation. Professor Lyndon Coombs, director of the Jumbunna Institute, stressed the report's intention to offer constructive feedback to all parties involved in the national agreement, emphasizing the need to amplify the voices of the communities the agreement aims to serve. The review's findings have prompted strong reactions from key figures involved in advocating for Indigenous rights. Tom Kalma, a Kungarikan and Awaja elder from the Northern Territory and former Social Justice Commissioner, highlighted the necessity for comprehensive consultations with diverse Indigenous groups and organizations. He emphasized the crucial need for accountability mechanisms to ensure Australian governments and organizations fulfill their obligations in redressing the systemic inequalities experienced by many Indigenous people. He further pointed out the inadequacy of relying primarily on community-controlled services, given that the majority of Indigenous people utilize mainstream services, which often lack cultural competency and fail to address ingrained racism and discrimination within their systems. Muriel Bamblett, CEO of the Victorian Aboriginal Child and Community Agency, echoed these concerns, directly condemning governments for their failure to achieve meaningful progress towards closing the gap. She underscored that without clear accountability and genuine partnerships between governments and Aboriginal communities, progress will remain critically slow. The report's findings resonate with a growing body of evidence highlighting the persistent challenges and systemic failures that continue to impede meaningful progress in improving the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. The stark reality presented by this review demands urgent action from all levels of government and a fundamental shift in approach to address the systemic issues that perpetuate inequality. The persistent under-resourcing of community-controlled organizations, coupled with the failure to hold mainstream services accountable for addressing racism and discrimination, underscores a deep-seated problem requiring far-reaching and transformative solutions. The call for a fundamental re-evaluation of the relationship between governments and Indigenous communities, along with the urgent need for greater accountability and resource allocation, signals a critical turning point in the ongoing struggle for Indigenous equality. The future success of the Closing the Gap strategy hinges on a genuine commitment to addressing systemic racism, empowering Indigenous-led initiatives, and fostering equitable partnerships between governments and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The long-term success depends not only on targets and metrics, but on a fundamental shift in the power dynamics and systemic inequalities that have historically hampered progress. The road ahead requires a profound commitment to meaningful action and genuine reconciliation.